The morning sun peeked through the windows of Atlanta International Airport as Jessica Reynolds walked toward the security checkpoint. Her black uniform blazer was neatly pressed, and her badge hung from a lanyard around her neck. After 12 years as an air marshal, going through security had become as routine as brushing her teeth. Today, though, something felt different. Jessica checked her watch. 6:30 in the morning. Still plenty of time before her flight. As an air marshal, she was used to early mornings and late nights. The job demanded vigilance and flexibility. She'd protected hundreds of flights since joining the Federal Air Marshal Service, but few passengers ever noticed her presence. That was the point. The security line moved slowly. Business travelers clutched coffee cups. Families corralled sleepy. Children and airport staff hurried through their designated lanes. Jessica stood tall, her dark eyes scanning the crowd out of habit. Even off duty, she couldn't turn off her training. When she reached the front of the line, Jessica presented her credentials to the TSA agent, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and tired eyes. "Good morning," Jessica said with a polite smile. "Federal Air Marshal Service." The agent glanced at her credentials, then at her face, then back at the credentials. His eyes narrowed. "I need to see additional identification," he said, his voice carrying an edge that wasn't there for the previous traveler. Jessica nodded and produced her government-issued ID. She'd been asked for secondary identification before. It wasn't common, but it happened occasionally. No reason for concern. The agent studied her ID for longer than necessary. He tapped his finger against the counter and looked past Jessica, catching the eye of another TSA officer. "Greg, can you come take a look at this?" he called. A second agent approached, this one taller with broad shoulders and a buzz cut. He took Jessica's credentials without acknowledging her. "What seems to be the issue?" Jessica asked, maintaining her professional tone. Neither agent responded directly. Instead, they whispered to each other, occasionally glancing at her. The line behind Jessica grew. Travelers shifted impatiently from foot to foot. "Ma'am, please step aside," the first agent finally said. "Is there a problem with my credentials?" Jessica asked. "Just step aside, please. We need to verify some information." Jessica moved to the designated area, a small space beside the main security line. Other travelers watched curiously as they passed through the checkpoint without issue. A few minutes later, a third TSA officer approached. From his uniform, Jessica could tell he was a supervisor. His nameplate read, Hoffman. "Good morning," Jessica greeted him. "I'm trying to understand the issue with my credentials." Hoffman didn't return the greeting. "These credentials don't look right," he said bluntly. Jessica blinked in surprise. "I assure you they're legitimate. I've been with the Federal Air Marshal Service for 12 years. Anyone can claim that," Hoffman replied. His voice rose slightly, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "We've had cases of people impersonating federal officers." Jessica felt her chest tighten. The implication was clear, and it stung. "Officer Hoffman," she said evenly, "my credentials are valid. You can call my supervisor to verify." "We'll handle this our way," Hoffman said dismissively. "I need you to come with me for additional screening." As Jessica followed him, she noticed other travelers watching. Some whispered to each other. A few pulled out phones, perhaps sensing drama. Jessica kept her head high and her expression neutral, though her mind raced. In all her years as an air marshal, she'd never been treated this way at a security checkpoint. Hoffman led her to a glass-walled room visible to everyone passing through security. Inside, 2 more TSA agents waited. One was a woman with auburn hair pulled into a tight bun. "Please place your belongings on the table," the female agent instructed. Jessica complied, setting down her carry-on bag. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor," she said firmly. "I am the supervisor for this checkpoint," Hoffman replied. "Then I'd like to speak with your manager," Jessica countered. Hoffman ignored her request and gestured to the other agents. "Check everything thoroughly." The agents emptied Jessica's bag item by item, inspecting each one with unusual scrutiny. They found her service weapon, secured in its proper holster as regulations required. "Why are you carrying a firearm?" Hoffman demanded loudly. As I've explained, I'm a federal air marshal, Jessica replied, keeping her voice steady despite her growing frustration. I'm authorized to carry my service weapon. Through the glass walls, Jessica noticed a white man in the same dark blazer she wore, clearly another air marshal, pass through security without any additional screening. The TSA agents barely glanced at his credentials before waving him through. Your documentation doesn't match our records, Hoffman stated flatly. Jessica took a deep breath. What specifically doesn't match? Instead of answering, Hoffman picked up her phone from the table. We'll need to check this as well. You do not have authorization to search my phone, Jessica said firmly. It contains sensitive information related to federal air security protocols. Hoffman's expression hardened. If you have nothing to hide— This isn't about having something to hide, Jessica interrupted. It's about proper procedure and respect for federal security protocols. By now, 20 minutes had passed since Jessica first presented her credentials. Her flight assignment was approaching, and she was still stuck in this glass box being treated like a criminal. More concerning was the pattern she observed. Other air marshals, none of whom were black, moved through security without a second glance. I need to make a phone call, Jessica stated. I have an assignment, and this delay is interfering with national security protocols. You can make a call after we complete our verification, Hoffman replied coldly. Jessica checked her. Watch again. At this rate, she would miss her flight, a serious breach of her duties. She looked through the glass and noticed yet another air marshal, this time a white woman passing through security with a quick nod from the same agent who had stopped Jessica. This is discriminatory treatment, Jessica said, her voice low but intense. I've observed multiple air marshals passing through security without additional screening. The only difference I can see is the color of their skin compared to mine. Hoffman's face flushed red. Are you accusing us of racism? I'm stating a fact about what I've observed, Jessica replied calmly. And I'm requesting that you follow proper protocol for verifying federal officer credentials, which does not include detaining me in this manner. A fourth TSA officer entered the room, this one older with gray hair at his temples. His nameplate identified him as Reynolds, no relation to Jessica. His demeanor was different, less aggressive, more cautious. What's the situation here? He asked Hoffman. Potential credential fraud, Hoffman replied immediately. She claims to be an air marshal. Jessica addressed the new officer directly. I am Air Marshal Jessica Reynolds, badge number 7842. I've been detained here for nearly 30 minutes without cause, while other air marshals have been allowed through security without additional screening. I've requested to contact my supervisor multiple times, and that request has been denied. Officer Reynolds studied her credentials with a frown. These look legitimate to me, Hoffman. We received an alert about potential fraud, Hoffman insisted. What alert? Jessica asked. From whom? Hoffman didn't answer, instead turning to confer quietly with the other officers. Jessica caught fragments of their conversation, enough to understand that there had been no alert. This was Hoffman's call, based on his gut feeling about her credentials. Officer Reynolds seemed uncomfortable with the situation. He glanced at Jessica, then at his colleagues, then at the growing audience outside the glass walls. Several travelers had stopped to watch the drama unfold, and a few airport staff members hovered nearby, uncertain whether to intervene. We should contact her supervisor for verification, Officer Reynolds suggested to Hoffman. Not necessary, Hoffman replied curtly. I'm handling this. Jessica watched this exchange with growing certainty that she was being singled out unfairly. In all her years of service, she had experienced subtle biases and microaggressions, but this was different. This was blatant, public, and potentially damaging to her career if she missed her assignment. A group of travelers passed by the glass room, and among them, Jessica spotted another air marshal, a Latino man she recognized from training last year. He noticed her through the glass, did a double take, and frowned in confusion. Jessica gave him a subtle nod, hoping he might intervene or at least report the situation. I'm going to ask one more time, Jessica said firmly. Either verify my credentials properly by contacting my supervisor, or allow me to proceed to my assignment. This detention is unwarranted and potentially discriminatory. Are you threatening me? Hoffman asked, his voice rising. I'm stating facts, Jessica replied evenly. And I'm reminding you of proper protocol. By now, 45 minutes had passed. Jessica's flight was boarding and she was still in this glass box, her authority challenged, her identity questioned, her dignity under assault. But as frustration and anger bubbled within her, Jessica held on to her professionalism. She knew that losing her composure would only reinforce the stereotypes that had likely led to this situation in the first place. Officer Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. Hoffman, maybe? I've made my decision, Hoffman interrupted. I believe she's impersonating a federal officer. That's a serious crime. The accusation hung in the air, so outrageous that Jessica momentarily couldn't find words to respond. Outside, the glass more people had gathered, watching the drama unfold. Jessica felt their eyes on her, some curious, some judgmental, some sympathetic. In that moment, Jessica Reynolds made a decision. She'd followed protocol, remained professional, and attempted to resolve the situation peacefully. Now it was time to call in reinforcements. She wasn't just any air marshal. She was a decorated officer with connections throughout the Department of Homeland Security. And Hoffman had just made the biggest mistake of his career. The glass-walled security room felt smaller by the minute. Jessica stood with her back straight, facing the 4 TSA officers who had turned what should have been a routine checkpoint passage into a public spectacle. Through the transparent walls, curious travelers slowed their pace, some openly staring at the confrontation. I am not impersonating anyone, Jessica said, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. I am Air Marshal Jessica Reynolds, and you are interfering with a federal security operation. Hoffman crossed his arms, unmoved. If that's true, then you won't mind waiting while we run a full verification? I've already missed my assignment flight, Jessica replied, glancing at her watch. That's a serious breach of protocol caused by your actions. The 4th officer, Reynolds, looked increasingly uncomfortable. Hoffman, shouldn't we just call the Federal Air Marshal Service Office? They can verify her identity in minutes. We follow our procedures here, Hoffman snapped. Not shortcuts. Jessica noticed a subtle exchange of glances between the other officers. They were growing unsure, perhaps realizing that Hoffman was overstepping. The female officer with the auburn hair took a small step back, creating distance between herself and Hoffman. Outside the glass room, the crowd had grown. Among the onlookers were airport staff, travelers, and, Jessica noticed with a mix of relief and embarrassment, 2 more air marshals who had apparently been alerted to the situation. They stood at the back of the crowd, observing carefully, their postures indicating they were ready to intervene if necessary. Officer Hoffman, Jessica said, her tone calm but firm, you have detained me for nearly an hour based on unfounded suspicions. During this time, I have observed at least 3 other air marshals pass through security without additional screening. The only apparent difference between them and me is the color of our skin. That's a serious accusation, Hoffman replied, his face flushing deeper red. It is, Jessica agreed, and it's one I'm prepared to pursue formally if the situation isn't resolved immediately. The female TSA officer cleared her throat. Sir, maybe we should... I'm handling this, Chen. Hoffman interrupted. Officer Chen fell silent, but her discomfort was visible. The tension in the room had shifted. What had begun as a unified front against Jessica was fracturing as the other officers sensed they might be participating in something improper. Jessica's phone lay on the table beside her emptied bag. I need to make a call, she said, reaching for it. Hoffman stepped forward quickly. That phone stays where it is. You have no authority to confiscate my phone, Jessica stated. I am a federal officer requesting to contact my superiors about an active interference with my duties. For all we know, you could be calling accomplices, Hoffman said, his accusation so outlandish that Officer Reynolds actually winced. Jessica took a deep breath. The situation had moved beyond simple misunderstanding or even ordinary prejudice. Hoffman seemed determined to escalate, perhaps hoping she would react emotionally and give him an excuse to detain her further. "Officer Reynolds," Jessica said, addressing the older officer directly and ignoring Hoffman. "I'm making a formal request to contact the Regional Director of Air Marshal Operations. This has gone far beyond standard verification." Reynolds hesitated, glancing at Hoffman, who glared back at him. "Don't undermine me," Hoffman warned his colleague. But something had changed. The dynamic in the room had shifted as the other officers began to recognize the potential consequences of what was happening. Through the glass walls, more people had gathered. Among them now were several airport officials in suits, watching the scene with concern. "She has the right to make a call," Officer Reynolds finally said, his voice quiet but determined. "I make the decisions at this checkpoint," Hoffman insisted. Officer Chen stepped forward. "Sir, this is getting out of hand. We should let her call, her supervisor." Hoffman turned to Chen, his expression furious. "Are you questioning my authority too?" While Hoffman was distracted, Officer Reynolds nudged Jessica's phone toward her. She took it with a small nod of thanks. "I'm calling the regional director now," Jessica announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. Hoffman spun back around. "Put that down." But Jessica had already dialed. As the phone rang, she maintained eye contact with Hoffman, refusing to be intimidated. When the call connected, she spoke clearly and professionally. "Director Washington, this is Air Marshal Reynolds. I'm currently being detained at Atlanta International Airport Security Checkpoint B. The TSA officers, led by Supervisor Hoffman, have confiscated my credentials, accused me of impersonating a federal officer, and prevented me from boarding my assigned flight." Jessica listened for a moment, then continued. "Yes, sir. I've requested verification multiple times. They've refused to contact the FAM's office." Another pause. "No, sir. 3 other air marshals have passed through without additional screening. During my detention, all of them were white." Hoffman's face had turned from red to ashen as he realized who was on the other end of the call. The regional director of Air Marshal Operations was not someone a TSA supervisor wanted to anger. "Yes, sir. I'll put you on speaker," Jessica said, tapping the screen and placing the phone on the table. A deep, authoritative voice filled the small room. "This is Regional Director Washington. Who am I speaking with?" Silence fell. Hoffman stared at the phone as if it might bite him. "Sir, this is Officer Reynolds, TSA. Officer Reynolds, where is Supervisor Hoffman, who was leading this detention?" Hoffman cleared his throat. "This is Supervisor Hoffman, sir." "Supervisor Hoffman, can you explain why one of my air marshals has been detained for over an hour, causing her to miss her security assignment?" "We received—" "There was a concern about her credentials," Hoffman stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating. "What specific concern?" Director Washington demanded. "They appeared unusual." "Unusual? How?" "Air Marshal Reynolds has been with the service for 12 years. Her credentials are identical to every other air marshal's." Hoffman had no answer. "Sir," Jessica said into the silence, "during my detention, I've observed 3 other air marshals pass through this same checkpoint without additional screening. 1 man and 2 women, all white." "Is that correct, Supervisor Hoffman?" Washington asked. I can't confirm that." "The security cameras can," Washington replied. "I've already requested the footage." A knock at the glass door interrupted the conversation. A man in an airport security uniform entered, followed by a woman in a business suit whose ID badge identified her as part of airport management. "What's going on here?" the woman asked, her gaze sweeping over the scene. "Catherine Lee, airport. Operations manager?" She introduced herself, then nodded at Jessica. "Air Marshal Reynolds. Director Washington called my office." Hoffman's posture deflated further. Events were spinning rapidly out of his control. "Ms. Lee," Washington's voice came through the phone. "I'd appreciate your assistance in resolving this situation immediately." "Of course, Director," Lee replied. "Air Marshal Reynolds, please accept our apologies for this incident. You're free to go." She can't just leave, Hoffman protested weakly. We haven't verified. I've verified her identity, Lee interrupted, sharply. And Director Washington has confirmed it. That's more than sufficient. Jessica gathered her belongings, her movements deliberate and composed despite the turmoil inside her. As she repacked her bag, she documented the scene mentally, noting names, times, and specific statements. This incident wouldn't end with her walking away. Air Marshal Reynolds. Washington's voice came through the phone again. We've arranged another flight for you. But before you go, I want to be clear. What happened today will be fully investigated. Thank you, sir, Jessica replied. Hoffman stepped forward, his demeanor suddenly conciliatory. Marshal Reynolds, there seems to have been a misunderstanding. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Jessica cut him off quietly. This was a deliberate humiliation. The glass door opened again, and this time, 2 air marshals entered. The same ones Jessica had spotted in the crowd earlier. Both nodded respectfully to her. We're here to escort you, Marshal Reynolds, the taller one said. Jessica turned to look one last time at Hoffman. You should know that this isn't just about me. I've heard reports from other minority air marshals about similar treatment at this checkpoint. Today you picked the wrong person to harass. As Jessica exited the glass room, the crowd of onlookers parted. Some people avoided her gaze, embarrassed by what they had witnessed. Others nodded in solidarity or offered small smiles of support. A few recorded the scene on their phones, ensuring that what had happened would not remain confined to this airport. The 2 air marshals walked beside Jessica, creating a buffer between her and the curious crowd. As they moved away from the checkpoint, Jessica's phone buzzed with multiple notifications. News of the incident was already spreading through internal channels. Are you okay? One of the escorting marshals asked quietly. I'm fine, Jessica replied automatically, though the truth was more complicated. She was angry, hurt, and exhausted. But mostly, she was resolved. What had happened today wasn't unique. It was simply visible. They reached a quieter area of the terminal away from the busy checkpoint. Jessica paused, needing a moment to process everything that had occurred. Her heart was still racing, her hands slightly trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. They treated you like a criminal, the second marshal said, shaking his head, in disgust. In front of everyone. Yes, they did, Jessica agreed, and they've done it to others before me. Her phone rang again, this time her direct supervisor, Chief Thomas. Reynolds, she answered. Jessica, I just heard. This is unacceptable, Thomas said, his voice tight with anger. The director is furious. He's already on the phone with TSA headquarters. I documented everything, Jessica told him. Names, times, statements. Good. We'll need that for the formal complaint, but Jessica, are you all right? Do you want to take the day? Jessica considered the question. Part of her wanted to retreat, to take time to process the humiliation and injustice she had experienced. But a stronger part recognized the importance of continuing her duties, of showing that incidents like this couldn't derail her commitment to her job. No, she decided. I want to take the next available flight assignment. This doesn't stop me from doing my job. Thomas was silent for a moment. You're sure? Positive, Jessica replied. But I will be filing a comprehensive report about what happened, and I expect it to be taken seriously. It will be, Thomas promised, all the way up the chain. As Jessica ended the call, she noticed a group of TSA officials hurrying toward the security checkpoint, their expressions grave. Among them was a senior administrator she recognized from regional meetings. The wheels of accountability were already turning. The 2 air marshals who had escorted her watched this development with satisfaction. Looks like there's going to be hell to pay, one commented. Good, Jessica said simply. She checked her watch again. An hour and 15 minutes had passed since she first presented her credentials at the checkpoint. In that time, she had been questioned, humiliated, and accused of a federal crime, all because a TSA supervisor couldn't believe that a black woman could be a federal air marshal. As they walked toward the airline service desk to arrange her new flight assignment, Jessica felt a strange mix of emotions. The anger remained, as did the hurt, but there was also a sense of purpose. What had happened today wasn't just about her. It was about a pattern of behavior that affected many people who looked like her. Hoffman had made a critical miscalculation. He had assumed she was powerless, that she could be intimidated and dismissed. He had picked the wrong person to harass, and he was about to learn exactly how wrong he had been. Jessica sat in a quiet corner of the airport's executive lounge, her fingers flying across the screen of her tablet. The airline had offered her this private space after learning about the incident at security. A small gesture that couldn't erase what had happened, but at least provided her with a quiet place to gather her thoughts. A cup of coffee sat untouched beside her as she documented every detail while the memory was still fresh. Time of initial credential presentation, 6:32 a.m., she typed. First TSA agent requested secondary ID at 6:33 a.m. Jessica paused, recalling the agent's expression. There had been something in his eyes, not just suspicion, but almost a hint of satisfaction, as if he'd been looking for a reason to pull someone aside. She continued typing, recording every question, every comment, every glance exchanged between the TSA officers. The timeline grew longer, painting a damning picture of escalating harassment and blatant discrimination. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call. Director Washington again. Reynolds, she answered. Jessica, I've got the deputy, Secretary of Homeland Security on the other line, Washington said, his voice tense. This has already reached the highest levels. Jessica straightened in her seat. The deputy secretary was only 2 positions removed from a cabinet position. This was escalating faster than she had anticipated. The airport security footage has been secured, Washington continued, and we're getting reports that bystanders posted videos online. This is moving quickly. I understand, Jessica said. I'm preparing my official statement now. Good. Be thorough, be precise, and don't hold back. We need the full picture. After ending the call, Jessica returned to her documentation. As she typed, she recalled similar stories she'd heard from other minority officers over the years. Small indignities, extra questions, lingering suspicions. Most had simply endured it, knowing that complaints often went nowhere. But Jessica had always promised herself she wouldn't stay silent if it happened to her. A soft knock on the lounge door interrupted her thoughts. Catherine Lee, the airport operations manager, entered with a man in a crisp suit whom Jessica didn't recognize. Marshal Reynolds, Lee said. This is Anthony Chen, head of security for Atlanta International. Chen extended his hand. Marshal Reynolds, I want to personally apologize for what happened today. It was unacceptable, and we're taking immediate steps to address it. Jessica shook his hand but didn't offer empty reassurances that everything was fine. It wasn't. We've placed Supervisor Hoffman on administrative leave pending investigation, Chen continued, and we're reviewing all security checkpoint interactions over the past 6 months to identify any patterns. 6 months isn't enough, Jessica replied calmly. This has been happening longer than that. Chen looked uncomfortable. You have specific information? I have colleagues who've reported similar experiences at this airport going back at least 2 years, Jessica said. None of their complaints received proper attention. Lee and Chen exchanged glances. This was clearly news to them, or at least news they hadn't expected Jessica to know about. We'd appreciate any details you can share, Lee said carefully. I'll include them in my formal statement, Jessica replied. But right now, I need to finish documenting today's incident while it's still fresh. They nodded and left her to her work, the tension in their postures betraying their concern. This was rapidly becoming more than an isolated incident. It was threatening to expose a systemic problem that airport leadership had either ignored or failed to recognize. Jessica returned to her tablet, adding notes about what Lee and Chen had just told her. As she worked, she received a text from one of the air marshals who had escorted her earlier. Videos from the checkpoint already have 50K plus views online. Hoffman is toast. Social media, the great amplifier of injustice. Jessica wasn't surprised that passengers had recorded the confrontation. In today's world, A black woman being publicly harassed by authority figures was exactly the kind of incident that attracted attention. In this case, that attention might actually help ensure accountability. An hour later, Jessica had completed her detailed account. 17 pages documenting every word, every action, every protocol violation. She attached supporting materials, the timestamps from security cameras, the names of witnesses, and statements from 3 other minority air marshals who had experienced similar treatment at Atlanta International. Just as she was about to send the document to Director Washington, her phone rang again. This time it was Chief Thomas. "Jessica, are you still at the airport?" "Yes, in the executive lounge." "Stay there. The TSA chief for the Southeast region is on his way. He wants to speak with you directly." Jessica felt a flutter of surprise. The regional TSA chief was several levels above Supervisor Hoffman, one of the highest-ranking TSA officials in this part of the country. "When should I expect him?" she asked. "About 20 minutes, and Jessica, he's bringing his boss." After ending the call, Jessica took a moment to collect herself. She smoothed her blazer, checked her appearance in the reflection of her phone screen, and reviewed her notes one more time. This meeting could determine whether what happened today led to real change or was simply swept under the rug with empty promises. Exactly 19 minutes later, another knock came at the lounge door. This time, 4 people entered: Catherine Lee, Anthony Chen, and 2 men in suits whom Jessica didn't recognize. The older of the 2 stepped forward, extending his hand. "Marshal Reynolds, I'm William Barnes, TSA Chief for the Southeast Region. This is David Turner, Deputy Administrator for the TSA." Jessica shook their hands, noting their grave expressions. Turner, the Deputy Administrator, was the second highest-ranking official in the entire Transportation Security Administration, answering only to the TSA Administrator himself. His presence indicated just how serious this situation had become. "Thank you for meeting with us," Turner said. "I want to start by offering our sincere apologies for what happened today." "With all due respect, sir," Jessica replied, "I'm less interested in apologies than in concrete actions. This isn't an isolated incident." Turner nodded soberly. "We're beginning to understand that. The videos circulating online have prompted other officers to come forward with their experiences. I've documented several cases in my report," Jessica said, gesturing to her tablet. "And I suspect there are many more who haven't spoken up out of fear of retaliation." Barnes shifted uncomfortably. "We take these allegations very seriously, Marshal Reynolds." "They're not allegations," Jessica corrected him firmly. "They're documented incidents with multiple witnesses. What happened today was simply visible enough that it couldn't be ignored." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. The 4 officials exchanged glances, seeming unsure how to proceed. Jessica waited, refusing to fill the silence with reassurances or softening her stance. Finally, Turner spoke again. "We'd like to see your report if you're willing to share it." Jessica nodded and forwarded the document to the email addresses they provided. For the next few minutes, the only sound in the room was their fingers scrolling through her detailed account, their expressions growing increasingly troubled as they read. Barnes was the first to look up. "This is extremely concerning." "It's damning," Turner corrected, his voice tight. "And it points to a pattern that goes beyond one supervisor or one checkpoint." Jessica remained silent, letting the weight of her documentation speak for itself. "Marshal Reynolds," Turner continued, "would you be willing to participate in a formal review of security practices at this airport? Your perspective would be invaluable." "I would," Jessica replied, "but only if I can be assured that it will lead to concrete changes, not just a report that gathers dust on a shelf." "You have my word," Turner said, meeting her gaze directly. "What happened today isn't just a PR problem for us, it's a fundamental failure of our mission. We can't ensure aviation security if we're alienating federal partners and engaging in discriminatory practices." Jessica considered his words carefully. She had heard similar promises before, but the presence of such high-ranking officials and the public nature of today's incident suggested that this time might be different. "There's something else you should know," she said after a moment. I'm not the only one documenting these incidents. There's a group of us, federal officers from various agencies who have experienced similar treatment. We've been collecting data for months. This revelation clearly surprised them. Barnes leaned forward. A formal group? An informal network? Jessica clarified. But with very formal documentation. Before anyone could respond, Jessica's phone rang again. Director Washington's name flashed on the screen. "Excuse me, I need to take this," she said, stepping aside. "Jessica, the deputy, secretary just called the TSA administrator directly," Washington said without preamble. "This is now being treated as a major civil rights issue within DHS. You're going to get a call from the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties within the hour." "I understand," Jessica replied. "The deputy TSA administrator is here with me." "Now," Washington paused. "Turner is there? Good. Tell him I'll be joining you shortly. The secretary wants this resolved today." Jessica ended the call and turned back to the group. "Director Washington will be here soon. He's been in contact with the deputy secretary, who has spoken directly with the TSA administrator." Turner nodded grimly. "I just got that message as well." The atmosphere in the room had shifted. What had begun as an attempt to manage a potential public relations problem had transformed into something much larger, a moment of reckoning for an agency already under scrutiny for its treatment of minorities. "While we wait for Director Washington," Jessica said, "I'd like to discuss specific changes that need to happen immediately, not promises of review or future reforms, actual changes in protocol and accountability that can be implemented today." For the next 30 minutes, Jessica outlined concrete steps: mandatory review of all discrimination complaints from the past 3 years, immediate reassignment of supervisors with multiple complaints, transparent reporting of security check, disparities and body cams for all TSA officers interacting with law enforcement personnel. As she spoke, Turner and Barnes took notes, occasionally asking questions or requesting clarification. They didn't push back or offer excuses, a promising sign that they recognized the gravity of the situation. Jessica was just finishing her recommendations when another knock came at the door. Director Washington entered, accompanied by a woman in a navy suit who introduced herself as Elena Rodriguez from the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. The small lounge was now crowded with high-ranking officials from multiple agencies, all focused on addressing what had begun as one supervisor's decision to harass a black air marshal. Jessica felt a mix of validation and exhaustion. The system was finally paying attention, but it had taken a public humiliation and the threat of viral videos to make it happen. "Before we continue," Rodriguez said, "I want to clarify that this is now an official civil rights investigation. Everything said here will be on the record." Barnes looked like he might object, but Turner placed a hand on his colleague's arm and nodded. "We understand, and we welcome the oversight. The TSA cannot fulfill its mission if we're engaging in or tolerating discriminatory practices." Director Washington turned to Jessica. "Marshal Reynolds, are you comfortable proceeding with this discussion?" Jessica straightened in her chair, feeling the weight of responsibility not just for herself but for every officer who had faced similar treatment without the benefit of viral videos or high-level connections. "Yes," she replied firmly. "I'm ready to move forward." As the discussion resumed, Jessica remained focused and articulate, laying out not just the problems but potential solutions. With each passing minute, it became clearer that what had happened at that security checkpoint was about to end the careers of several TSA officials, including Hoffman, and spark a fundamental reevaluation of how the agency operated. What had begun as a routine morning had transformed into a pivotal moment in Jessica's career and in the ongoing struggle for equal treatment within federal agencies. She had never sought to be at the center of such a controversy, but now that she was determined to use the opportunity to create lasting change. The harassment she had experienced would not be forgotten or minimized. Instead, it would become the catalyst for reforms that would protect others from similar treatment in the future. And it had all unfolded in less than 10 minutes. The airport conference room buzzed with tension as Jessica sat at the head of the table surrounded by officials from the TSA, Department of Homeland Security, and Airport Administration. What had started in a glass-walled security room had exploded into a high-level meeting that would determine the fate of several careers and potentially reshape security protocols nationwide. "Let's review the security footage," said Elena Rodriguez from the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, nodding to a technician who stood ready by a laptop connected to a large screen on the wall. The room fell silent as the video began to play. From multiple angles, high-definition cameras had captured every moment of Jessica's ordeal. The footage was damning, clear, unambiguous evidence of discriminatory treatment. The cameras showed other air marshals passing through the same checkpoint without additional screening, while Jessica was pulled aside, questioned, and eventually detained in the glass room. Jessica watched the footage with an outward calm that masked her inner turmoil. Seeing herself on screen, surrounded by TSA officers who questioned her identity and authority, brought back the humiliation and anger she had felt. But it also strengthened her resolve. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about ensuring that no one else would face similar treatment. The video paused on a particularly telling moment. Hoffman leaning close to Jessica, his finger pointed at her face, his expression contemptuous. The timestamp showed this was nearly 40 minutes after she had first presented her credentials. "This is completely unacceptable," Deputy Administrator Turner said, breaking the heavy silence. "The body language alone demonstrates a clear abuse of authority." Director Washington nodded grimly. "And it directly contradicts Supervisor Hoffman's written statement, claiming that he maintained a professional demeanor throughout the interaction." Jessica glanced at the copy of Hoffman's statement that had been distributed earlier. In it, he claimed that Jessica had been confrontational and uncooperative, and that his actions were motivated solely by security concerns regarding potentially falsified credentials. "He's lying," Jessica said simply. "The video proves it." "Yes, it does," Rodriguez agreed. "But what's even more concerning is this." She gestured to the technician, who switched to a different segment of footage. This clip showed Hoffman speaking with another TSA officer before Jessica had even reached the checkpoint. The audio was faint, but enhanced by the technician, his words became clear. "Keep an eye on the black woman in the blazer. Something doesn't look right." A murmur ran through the room. This was the smoking gun, proof that Hoffman had targeted Jessica before she ever presented her credentials, before he could possibly have had any legitimate security concerns. "Premeditated discrimination," Rodriguez stated flatly. He decided she was suspicious based solely on her appearance. William Barnes, the TSA chief for the Southeast region, looked physically ill. "This goes beyond one bad supervisor. This is a systemic failure of oversight and training." "Exactly," Jessica said, speaking up. "And that's why addressing just Hoffman's behavior isn't enough. The other officers who stood by and participated, the supervisors who allowed this culture to develop, the lack of clear protocols for verifying federal officer credentials, all of it needs to be addressed." Catherine Lee, the airport operations manager, pushed a folder across the table toward Jessica. "We've pulled the complaint records you requested. In the past 18 months, we've received 27 formal complaints about discriminatory treatment at security checkpoints. 17 of those complaints involved Hoffman's checkpoint. And how many resulted in disciplinary action?" Jessica asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Lee hesitated before responding. "None. They were all dismissed due to insufficient evidence or conflicting accounts." "Until now," Deputy Secretary Harris said from the doorway. Everyone turned, surprised by the unexpected arrival of such a high-ranking official. Harris entered the room, his presence immediately commanding attention. As the second highest official in the Department of Homeland Security, his involvement signaled just how seriously this incident was being taken at the highest levels of government. "I apologize for interrupting," Harris said, taking a seat next to Washington. "But after reviewing the initial reports, I felt this required my personal attention." Jessica straightened in her chair, recognizing the significance of Harris's presence. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It had become a flashpoint for addressing long-standing issues within the agency. Deputy Secretary, Jessica, acknowledged with a nod. "Thank you for coming." Harris turned to her with a grave expression. "Marshal Reynolds, on behalf of the department, I want to extend our deepest apologies for what you experienced today. It was unacceptable, inexcusable, and contrary to everything we stand for as federal servants." Jessica appreciated the sincerity in his voice, but she remained focused on the larger issues. "Thank you, sir. But I'm more interested in ensuring this doesn't happen to anyone else." "As am I," Harris replied, "which is why I've authorized an immediate departmental review of all TSA checkpoint procedures, with special attention to how federal law enforcement officers are processed and how discrimination complaints are handled." Turner looked startled. "A department-wide review?" "Yes," Harris confirmed. "What happened here isn't isolated to Atlanta. We've received similar reports from airports across the country. This incident simply brought it to a head because it was so blatant and so well documented." Jessica listened as Harris outlined immediate actions. Hoffman would be terminated, not just placed on administrative leave. The other officers who had participated would face disciplinary proceedings. A task force would be formed to rewrite security protocols for interactions with federal officers, with input from representatives of various agencies. "And we want you to be part of that task force, Marshal Reynolds," Harris said, turning to her. "Your experience and perspective would be invaluable." Jessica considered the offer. Part of her wanted nothing more than to put this incident behind her and return to her regular duties. But a stronger part recognized the opportunity to create meaningful change, to transform a personal humiliation into a catalyst for reform. "Would be honored to serve," she replied. As the meeting continued, Jessica presented the additional documentation she had gathered, statements from other minority officers who had experienced similar treatment, statistics showing disparities in secondary screening rates, and a detailed timeline of how her own complaints had been repeatedly ignored until today's incident forced a response. The officials listened with growing concern, occasionally exchanging glances that betrayed their discomfort. This wasn't just about one supervisor's biased behavior. It was about a pattern of discrimination that had been allowed to persist despite multiple warnings. "What's particularly troubling," Jessica noted, "is that I submitted a formal complaint about checkpoint procedures 6 months ago after witnessing a black colleague receive similar treatment. That complaint was never acknowledged." Barnes shuffled through his papers, looking increasingly uncomfortable. I don't see any record of that complaint in our files." "Because it was buried," Rodriguez said bluntly. "We found it in the archived Resolved folder, despite no resolution ever being communicated to Marshal Reynolds." The revelation hung in the air, a damning indictment of a system designed to silence complaints rather than address them. "This stops today," Harris declared, his voice firm. "I'm implementing a new oversight protocol effective immediately. All discrimination complaints will be reviewed by an independent panel, with representatives from the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, the Inspector General's Office, and rotating members from various federal agencies." The meeting continued for another hour, with detailed discussions of policy changes, accountability measures, and next steps. Throughout it all, Jessica remained poised and professional, offering insights and suggestions based on her years of experience navigating a system that hadn't always treated her fairly. As the meeting drew to a close, Harris addressed Jessica directly. "Marshal Reynolds, your composure and professionalism throughout this ordeal have been remarkable. Many would have lost their temper or given up, but you stood your ground and followed proper channels even when the system was failing." "You," Jessica nodded in acknowledgement. "I never wanted to be at the center of something like this, but once it happened, I knew I had a responsibility to use it as an opportunity for change. And change is exactly what will happen," Harris assured her, starting with Hoffman. As if on cue, Catherine Lee's phone buzzed with a message. She glanced at it, then looked up. Hoffman has been officially terminated, effective immediately. Security is escorting him from the building now." A ripple of satisfaction ran through the room. It wasn't often that accountability happened so swiftly, especially for those in positions of authority. "That's just the beginning," Harris said. "By the end of the week, I want a complete review of every supervisor at this airport with multiple discrimination complaints." This kind of behavior doesn't exist in isolation. As the meeting adjourned, officials approached Jessica one by one, offering cards, contact information, and in some cases, genuine apologies for what she had experienced. She accepted them all graciously, knowing that meaningful change would require ongoing communication and collaboration. Rodriguez stayed behind after the others had left, sitting beside Jessica as she gathered her notes. "You know, what you did today wasn't just brave. It was strategic. You documented everything, followed protocol even when others weren't, and created a record that couldn't be ignored or dismissed." Jessica smiled slightly. 12 years in federal service teaches you a few things about how the system works, both its strengths and its weaknesses. "Well, you used that knowledge effectively," Rodriguez replied. "This incident will change things not just here but nationwide. Sometimes it takes one person standing firm to break through institutional inertia." As they walked out together, Jessica noticed a small crowd gathered near the conference room. Airport staff, travelers, and even a few TSA officers, watching with curious expressions. Word had spread about the high-level meeting and its purpose. Among the onlookers was a young black woman in a TSA uniform, her expression a mix of awe and gratitude as she made eye contact with Jessica. No words were exchanged, but a message passed between them nonetheless. "You are not alone. Things can change." Outside the conference area, Director Washington was waiting. "Ready for a debrief?" he asked as Jessica approached. "Actually," Jessica replied, checking her watch, "I'd like to return to active duty. There's a flight to Chicago. In 90 minutes, that needs coverage." Washington raised an eyebrow. "After everything that's happened today, you want to jump right back in?" "That's exactly why I want to jump back in," Jessica said firmly. "What happened today doesn't define me or my career. My work does." Washington nodded with respect. "The assignment is yours, if you want it." As Jessica walked toward the departure gate, her phone buzzed with notifications. The videos from the security checkpoint had indeed gone viral, appearing on news sites and social media platforms across the country. Her name was trending, her face featured in headlines about discrimination and accountability. It was strange to suddenly be in the spotlight after years of working in the shadows. Air marshals typically avoided public attention, their effectiveness depending partly on anonymity. But sometimes visibility was necessary to create change. At the departure gate, Jessica scanned the waiting passengers, business travelers tapping on laptops, families corralling excited children, elderly couples sitting patiently with their boarding passes ready. None of them knew that an air marshal would be on their flight watching over them, ready to respond to any threat. None of them knew what had happened just hours earlier at a security checkpoint, or how that incident was already reshaping policies and procedures throughout the nation's airports. None of them knew that the woman in the dark blazer who boarded just before the final call had just changed the course of aviation security history, and that was exactly as it should be. Jessica Reynolds had never sought recognition or acclaim. She had simply done her job with integrity and stood her ground when faced with injustice. Sometimes that was enough to change the world. 2 weeks had passed since the incident at Atlanta to International Airport, but the ripple effects continued to spread throughout the federal law enforcement community. Jessica sat at her desk in the Regional Air Marshal Office reviewing the latest memo from DHS headquarters, the fourth such document since that fateful morning at the security checkpoint. Effective immediately, the memo read, all Transportation Security Administration personnel will undergo mandatory anti-bias training developed in partnership with the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. Completion of this training will be required for continued employment. Jessica set the document aside and opened her email. Her inbox had been flooded with messages from colleagues around the country, some offering support, others sharing similar experiences, many asking for advice on how to document and report discrimination. She had become, almost overnight, an unofficial point person for federal officers facing bias in the workplace. A knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. Director Washington entered, carrying a folder stamped with "Confidential" in bold red letters. "Morning, Jessica," he said, taking a seat across from her desk. "How are you holding up with all this attention?" "I'm managing," she replied with a small smile, "though I'm looking forward to getting back to regular flight assignments next week." Washington nodded. "About that, I've got something I need to discuss with you first." He placed the folder on her desk and slid it toward her. Jessica opened it to find an official letter on Department of Homeland Security letterhead. "They want me to lead the new Federal Officer Protocol Task Force?" she asked, looking up from the document. "Not just lead it, they want you to create it," Washington clarified. "The Deputy Secretary was impressed with your handling of the situation and your recommendations for systemic changes. This would be a 6-month assignment, developing new protocols for how federal officers are treated at security checkpoints nationwide." Jessica leaned back in her chair, considering the offer. It wasn't what she had expected or even what she had wanted. She was a field agent, not an administrator. Her place was on aircraft, not in committee meetings. "I know it's not your usual territory," Washington said, seeming to read her thoughts. "But sometimes we're called to serve in different ways than we planned." Jessica picked up the letter again, scanning the details. The task force would have real authority to implement changes, with direct reporting to the Deputy Secretary. It wasn't a symbolic position or a way to sideline her. It was a genuine opportunity to fix a broken system. "Can I think about it?" she asked. Washington nodded. "Of course. They need an answer by Friday." After he left, Jessica turned to her computer and pulled up the news coverage of the incident. The initial viral videos had led to broader reporting on discrimination within federal agencies, with several major outlets running investigative pieces, featuring anonymous accounts from minority officers across different departments. The TSA had taken the brunt of the criticism, but the conversation had expanded to include Customs and Border Protection, the FBI, and even local police departments. What had happened to Jessica had become a catalyst for a national reckoning about how law enforcement officers treated one another, and by extension, the public they served. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her sister. "Just saw you on the morning news again. You doing okay with all this?" Jessica smiled and typed back, "Taking it one day at a time. Still surreal." Her sister responded immediately, "Mom would be so proud." The mention of their mother, a former civil rights attorney who had passed away 3 years earlier, brought a lump to Jessica's throat. Her mother had dedicated her career to fighting systemic discrimination, often taking on cases that seemed unwinnable against powerful institutions. Jessica had chosen a different path, but now found herself facing similar challenges from within the system. Another knock at her door pulled her from these thoughts. This time it was Tyler Chen, a young air marshal who had joined the service just 2 years ago. "Sorry to interrupt," Chen said hesitantly. "Do you have a minute?" Jessica gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Of course. What's up?" Chen sat down, fidgeting nervously with his credential holder. "I wanted to thank you for what you did. My first year here, I experienced something similar at LAX. Not as bad as what happened to you, but..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "I didn't report it. I was still on probation and I was afraid it would affect my standing." Jessica nodded with understanding. "That's a common fear, and unfortunately, it's often justified." "But you spoke up," Chen said, his admiration evident. "And look what happened. Real changes, not just talk." "It wasn't just me," Jessica replied modestly. "The timing was right, the documentation was solid, and honestly, the fact that it was caught on video made a huge difference." Chen leaned forward. "But you were ready. You knew what to do, who to call, how to handle it. That's why I'm here, actually. Some of us newer marshals were wondering if you might be willing to talk to us sometime. Share your experience. Give us some guidance on how to respond if it happens to us." Jessica considered the request. It wasn't part of her official duties, but mentoring younger officers had always been important to her. And if her experience could help others navigate similar situations, wasn't that worth sharing? I'd be happy to, she said. Let's set something up for next week. After Chen left, Jessica returned to the letter from DHS, reading it more carefully this time. The position would be demanding, requiring her to travel to various airports, work with officials from multiple agencies, and likely face resistance from those comfortable with the status quo. But it would also give her the authority to implement real, lasting changes to a system that had failed too many officers like her. Her computer chimed with an incoming email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read, "Thank you from a fellow officer." Jessica opened it to find a message from a TSA officer at Atlanta International, a woman who had been present during Jessica's detention but hadn't directly participated. "I wanted to reach out and thank you for your courage," the email read. "What happened to you that day was wrong, and many of us knew it but were afraid to speak up. Since then, things have already started to change here. Hoffman's replacement is implementing new verification protocols that treat all officers with respect regardless of race or gender. More importantly, people are talking openly about biases that used to be ignored or denied. Your stand that day didn't just end one man's career, it started a conversation that was long overdue." The message continued, describing changes at the airport and expressing hope for continued improvements. It was signed simply, "A grateful colleague." Jessica sat back, letting the words sink in. When she had stood her ground that day, she hadn't been thinking about starting a movement or changing policies. She had simply refused to accept discriminatory treatment, refused to be diminished or denied her authority and dignity. But sometimes, that's how change begins, with one person saying enough and having the courage and preparation to back it up. Her phone rang, displaying a number she didn't recognize. "This is Reynolds," she answered. "Marshal Reynolds, this is Anthony Clark from the Secretary's office at DHS." The voice was crisp, professional. "Do you have a moment to speak with the Secretary?" Jessica straightened in her chair. "Yes, of course." There was a brief pause, and then a new voice came on the line. "Marshal Reynolds, this is Secretary Wilson. I wanted to personally thank you for your service and for bringing these important issues to light." "Thank you, sir," Jessica replied, surprised by the direct contact from a cabinet-level official. "I've reviewed your file, Marshal Reynolds," the Secretary continued. 12 years of exemplary service, numerous commendations, advanced training in multiple security disciplines. You're exactly the kind of officer we need leading our reform efforts." "I appreciate that, sir." "Have you had a chance to consider the task force position?" Wilson asked. "I'm still reviewing the details," Jessica said carefully. "It would be a significant change from my current field duties." "It would," the Secretary agreed. "But sometimes we're called to serve in ways we didn't anticipate. Your experience, combined with your professional background, makes you uniquely qualified to lead this initiative. And I can assure you, this isn't a symbolic position. You'll have real authority to implement changes." Jessica thought of the email she had just received from the TSA officer, of Chen's request for guidance, of her mother's legacy of fighting for justice within broken systems. "May I ask, sir, why me?" Jessica said. "I'm not the first officer to experience discrimination, and unfortunately I won't be the last." "No, you won't be the last," Wilson acknowledged. "But you handled the situation in a way that created an opportunity for systemic change. You didn't just get angry, though you had every right to. You documented everything, followed proper channels, even when they weren't working for you, and presented a clear case that couldn't be dismissed or explained away." He paused before continuing. "And frankly, Marshal Reynolds, you did it all with a dignity and professionalism that commands respect. That's exactly what we need in someone leading this task force." Jessica was silent for a moment, considering his words. The Secretary was right. She had approached the situation as a professional, not just as a victim of discrimination. She had used her training and experience to navigate a broken system and create an opening for change. "I'll take the position," she said finally. "But I have two conditions." "Go on," Wilson encouraged. "First, I want to retain my air marshal status and return to flight duty after the task force completes its work. I don't want this to become a permanent desk assignment." "That's reasonable," the secretary agreed. "And the second condition? I want real authority, not just to make recommendations, but to implement changes. And I want the task force to include representatives from minority officer associations across all federal agencies, not just DHS." There was a brief pause on the line. "That's actually two conditions," Wilson observed with a touch of humor in his voice. "But I agree to both. We'll draw up the paperwork immediately." After the call ended, Jessica sat at her desk for a long moment, processing the turn her career had taken. 2 weeks ago, she had been a field agent doing her job in relative anonymity. Now she was about to lead a high-profile initiative that could reshape federal security protocols nationwide. A knock at her open door drew her attention. It was Washington, again, smiling as if he already knew the outcome of her conversation with the secretary. "So," he said, "should I start looking for your replacement?" Jessica smiled back. "Just for 6 months. I'm taking the position, but I made it clear I want to return to flight duty afterward." Washington nodded approvingly. "I expected nothing less. You're a field agent at heart." "Yes," Jessica agreed. "But sometimes the most important work happens on the ground." Later that afternoon, Jessica stood at the window of her office watching aircraft take off and land at the nearby airport. Each plane carried hundreds of passengers, most of whom would never know about the air marshals on board protecting them. That anonymity had always been part of the job, working in the shadows, noticed only when something went wrong. But sometimes, she reflected, you had to step out of the shadows to fix the systems that were broken, to ensure that everyone could do their jobs without facing unnecessary barriers or discrimination. Her phone buzzed with a news alert. TSA chief for Southeast region resigns amid discrimination scandal. Another career ended, another domino falling in the aftermath of that morning at the security checkpoint. Jessica closed the alert and opened her calendar, already blocking out time for the next 6 months, meetings with agency heads, visits to major airports, sessions with training developers. The task ahead was daunting, but she was ready for it. The incident at Atlanta International hadn't defined her, but her response to it might define her legacy. Not just as the air marshal who stood her ground when faced with discrimination, but as the officer who transformed that moment into a movement for lasting change. As she gathered her things to head home for the day, Jessica thought again of her mother, who had always taught her that justice required more than moral outrage. It required strategic action, documentation, and persistence. The system doesn't change just because it should, her mother used to say. It changes because someone makes it change. 2 weeks ago, in the span of just 10 minutes, Jessica Reynolds had set in motion changes that would ripple through federal agencies for years to come. Not because she had sought that role, but because when the moment came, she had been prepared to stand firm, speak truth, and demand the respect she had earned. Sometimes that's all it takes to change a system. 10 minutes of clarity in the EO, face of injustice, backed by years of preparation and a lifetime of dignity. And as Jessica locked her office door and headed home, she carried with her the knowledge that her 10 minutes weren't over yet. They were still unfolding, still creating change, still opening doors for others who deserved the same respect and opportunity she had fought for. The glass walls of that security room had been meant to contain and humiliate her. Instead, they had become windows through which others could see the reality of discrimination and the power of one person standing firm against it. In the end, what had begun as harassment had become a catalyst for transformation, and Jessica Reynolds was just getting started.